Hello, and welcome to episode 184 of Prose. This week, revisit a Southern Baptist church in the South on a Sunday, and interact with an alien race. That's right, we will be revisiting two older stories this week. Two stories that are very far back in Prose's past, but I wanted to share with you again. Please consider heading to prosepodcast.com, our one-stop shop for all things Prose. There you can find links to social media, the episodes, a shop for swag, the show's Patreon, and more. On social media, like and share away. And most importantly, as always, please do consider subscribing, rating, and or reviewing wherever you grab your podcasts and music. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tales, shall we? This week we have Any Given Sunday, and So They Stopped. Enjoy.
Any Given Sunday. An original short story by Jared I. McGee. The sharply thin waif of a girl stared up at the pulpit from the beige cushioned seats. She thought them comfortable seats, certainly. That is, her mother's mother told stories of pews made of hard wood that would cause the back to ache after a matter of moments seated, the ache lasting well into lunch and never subsiding before the evening service, and, though she'd never experienced one like her mother and grandmother, she was quite confident that she'd not have enjoyed the experience. Supposedly, these unbearable sitting arrangements were instruments of purposeful torture put in place by the most devout of the anointed in order to keep minds wakeful, to ensure austere thoughts of the Holy Father, and to shepherd any wayward souls from wandering mental primrose paths too easily tread. Her grandmother, before passing, railed against this softening of the pews, swearing that the cushioning was a metaphor for the church as an institution. This Sunday, amid the driving rain and this unabated southern summer heat, Molly Elizabeth Landika, Molly Beth for short to her daddy, found it even harder than usual not to look around the sanctuary as Pastor Reimer tossed archaism after outdated archaism, muddled fact after muddled fact at the small Arkansan congregation. Sexism and myriad gender stereotypes. Not malicious, but present. Racism and xenophobia. Not intended, but innate. Historical inaccuracies and falsehoods. Not nefarious, just utterly ignorant and uneducated. Though she was only 16 and still thought of by the church family as a child, she knew enough to know that the sermon was dubious, questionable at best. Messages like this only served to reassure her that she was not long for this small town. She couldn't stay painted into these regressive corners that were being painted by the prevailing philosophies of the area and its backward, albeit mostly well-meaning, earnest, and kind denizens. Her real time for something exciting beyond the typical Sunday message was when Brother Rhymes hobbled down to the carpeted steps to wander closer to his flock in an old man's attempt at better connecting with his congregation. This might have been an effective and more electric means of connections, a la the Bill Clinton walk-around circa 1992 presidential debates that she heard about in school. But the old man used it every Sunday without fail, watering down the potency of the method with overuse. Still, he paced in his gait, halting with age, from one corner of the large room to the other, taking time to make eye contact with a great many of those in attendance, spending an equal amount of time on each of the 3 funnel-shaped columns of worshipers. This was a great personal touch. This is why these people loved Brother Rhymes. After his attempts at underscoring important biblical truths by way of volume juxtapositioning, mumbled husky whispers to elderly attempts at a strong unwavering shout, more mumbled husky whispers, followed by more elderly attempts at a strong unwavering shout, he calls out, "Now! It is time to pray. Bow your heads and speak with God." she can't help but think the pastor's overly emotive vocalization, God, sounds a great deal like what she hears on the videos that she watches on her phone before she clears her history. Repeatedly. Of what she says when she lets her hands wander of their own accord, out of boredom and curiosity most evenings. An errant thought, to be sure, especially in church. Those libertine cushioned seats were causing her mind to wander to the nightly wandering of her hands. This was not the place. She needed to distract herself so she could focus on her prayer, or at least on the show of her praying for her fellow churchgoers. As heads bowed to pray upon the pastor's command, she kept her head up just long enough to take yet another full survey of the room and the handful of new, exotic visitors. Though her eyes stalled on the young music director as he jogged up to his place on the vaulted platform, soaking up his so-tight jeans, his plaid shirt with the rolled-up sleeves, the fact that his siren of a wife was not in attendance today, she'd have to speak with him after the service. She was still able to take in all of the new faces dotted throughout the sanctuary. This was her one time a week to breach the bubble that was her small-town life. There. A man with a shiny bald head and a beard down to his belt buckle. Liver spots dotting his scalp. Clinging to his wife and the back of the row in front of him like he was wrestling with something from his present. The past is never that present in a prayer. There, a woman that is spilling out of her too-tight patterned maxi dress, rolls of excess fat jutting in between a great many of the seahorses and blowfish and dolphins printed in blue and gold and white. There, Janine. She's no visitor, that red-headed slut that everyone knew was a slut, caressing the back of the arm of her boyfriend of the moment, a younger boy with spiky dyed silver hair and too many shirts on. There, a man that is old. No, not old exactly. Older, certainly. Beard. Clothes that are certainly not from her backwoods town. Not rich, but with some style. His eyes aren't closed either. Their eyes met. She lurched, clenching her eyes shut in hopes that the eye contact was imagined or unintentional or unnoticed. Despite herself and what her father called her budding willfulness and what her homeroom teacher called her budding cynicism, she did always feel a bit guilty when she wasn't praying along with Pastor Rhymes. Her heart jackhammered, her mind sped through every possibility lent to her by innumerable fiction storylines. Older, wiser, worldly man comes out of the blue and rescues the would-be small-town princess. Money, adventure, travel, understanding, knowledge, sex, anything beyond Broken Branch and its small-town gravitational pull, the black hole that does not allow its citizens to escape. She shook her head a bit, attempting to look to any onlooker as if she were struggling with some personal burdens, and not shaking off her lightning round of imagination time and the soundtrack of Justin Bieber's Sorry blaring in her mind's ear that was competing with the acoustic guitar and her music director's admittedly sexy raspy-voiced renditions of Jeremy Camp's Give Me Jesus. Of course, she was being silly. No random man in a sea of the overtly, overly pious would give her a second look. She was a backwater nobody. 100 pounds soaking wet, as her father was always so keen to tell anyone that'd listen. Dingy, cornflower blue eyes complemented by a Milky Way of freckles and a halo of straight brown and auburn-tossed hair. A meekly inquisitive demeanor. A habit of smiling at the unknown and the unfamiliar. Today she was wearing a cheap Kmart top of faux lace and thin cotton with an all but black dark green cardigan. The cardigan being her mother's attempt to ensure that Molly didn't scandalize those attending services with bare shoulders and prominently featured breasts. She resolved to crack her eyes again, just enough for a quick peek back in the direction of that stranger who met her gaze during the prayer. That stranger that also threw caution to the wind and shucked tradition and the will of God himself. Maybe he really was looking at her. Molly stopped herself as she heard Brother Rhymes calling for the ushers to come forward and collect the offering. Even better. The prayer had ended. Everyone was digging for their wallets and purses, and that meant that she had an even better excuse to crane her neck this way and that to get another peek at that man. That man that had looked at her like she was something to behold, like she was something more than plain. The pastor called out to Deacon Smothers to say yet another prayer, this one blessing the offering, and all the heads bowed yet again, just as she found his face and locked eyes once again. Electricity jolted into her. This time, the corners of his mouth edged up ever so slightly as he tucked his chin and looked up through his eyelashes at her in what seemed an almost predatory glance. It was all of 2 or 3 seconds, and then his eyes were closed along with the rest of the church. She swayed on her feet, trying to not let the pounding of her heart beat her down onto the floor. She'd never been dizzy with giddiness before. She thought that was just a load of shit that TV shows tossed at girls, but wow, here it was. Giddiness forming dizziness. The prayer ended. They all sat. The offering plates began to circulate, the deacons flanking each pew as they made their way from the front to the back of the church. Molly bent this way and that as she sat, hoping that she could fake scrambling for her weekly $1 or $2 to throw in the offering plate well enough to avoid any disapproving stares, or worse, being written off at a glance by the strange man. Dad put his right arm around her, propping his left one up where Mom would usually sit when she's not on nursery duty. That made the search all the more difficult. She settled in her seat, letting her eyes dart this way and that as she tried to smoothly let her head slowly scan from right to left. Nothing. Pastor Rhymes stood up, said, "God bless y'all now. Get out here so you can beat those Methodists to Rhines and get the good seats." And with that, the music leader and his band began to crank away at a sped-up bluegrass version of I Saw the Light, playing the crowd out as they left. Molly and her father, along with the other 200 or so members of today's flock, made their way out of the sanctuary and toward the parking lot. She looked everywhere frantically, her head on a rapid swivel. So many churchgoers were shaking her hands, asking her how she was doing, being quite kind, taking an honest interest in her well-being and how she had been of late. The lobby just outside the sanctuary and just before the door was teeming with well-wishers. But all she could think of was that she was missing her shot to make the connection that might help her move toward the ever-elusive something else she just knew was out in the abstract there that everyone was always talking about in Broken Branch. Her father was not helping her search. He snagged her left arm and put it through his own bowed right arm in a mock courting, pulling her rather quickly out of the foyer of the church and toward his big blue Chevy diesel that would have her barreling back to the drab browns and grays and off-whites that were her life. As it turned out, the rain was still pounding outside, creating a cacophony on the roofs of the assemblage of vehicles. She squealed and celebrated internally, exuberant that her father, a Southern gentleman of the old order, would feel it necessary to walk by himself and pull the pickup around to pick her mother and her up to allow them to stay under the awning of the church and therefore dry. He excused himself on cue and pushed, staccato-stepped in his black cowboy boots into the downpour in the direction of their weekly parking space. With her mother distracted by her Sunday school friends and the tales they were all telling about their all having to spend the day manning the nursery and children's church that day, the chance to find her potential savior was clearly at hand. It was now or never. She heard the thick sound of what was clearly an expensive sound system pulsing to her right, vying for her ear's attention over the storm and winning. This was not the softened praise music or clangy country that her parents listened to when they drove together. No, she recognized that song. It was Heart Sigh by Purity Ring. That was one of the very few secular songs that she knew. Hannah, her friend, with far more permissive parents than her, had taken a shining to that tune, coming into it a bit later than was cool, but Molly knew it. Molly tried not to break into a run in that direction as she saw a large black SUV crawling forward with the velvety growl of an expensive engine, trying to leave but being blocked by the throngs of parishioners, not eager to go home and seemingly unaffected by the rain, be they with or without umbrellas. Rather quickly, she knew that she couldn't get to the car without being blatant about it, plus the crowd was beginning to realize that moving from out of the front of the vehicle would be the Christian thing to do. Molly knew this had to be him. It had to be. Even so, as she resigned herself to filing this little bit of excitement away for her wandering hands for later that evening, knowing that her imagination could and would fill in the gaps, taking the promise of adventure and turning it into something resembling an actual experience, at least in her own mind, the car's opaque tinted driver's side window crawled down, and the vehicle veered a little more in her direction. The face that met hers was certainly not that of a model or a pretty boy or a child or a grandpa. No, he was something else altogether. The weight of his molten gold eyes drew her in like all those terrible vampire movies her sister couldn't get enough of. Here, now, the stares weren't furtive and quick, stolen away from God's time in God's own house, no. Here, now, they each locked into the other's gaze openly and intently. The small smirking was allowed to blossom to a full smile that reminded her a great deal of Jack Nicholson, some older actor her parents still seemed to think was one of the greats despite his questionable morals, quote-unquote, to channel her father. Wrinkles and crinkles around the eyes and smile, flecks of gray and white in the beard, only the slightest of stubble on what was clearly a balding head recently clean-shaved. She walked toward him as if drawn in a trance. The rain pelted her, and she knew someone from the church would later be asking her what she thought she was doing there in the parking lot, heading towards a stranger, likely admonishing her for walking into rain in so sheer and so transparent white a top. There wasn't much left to the imagination now. That was her channeling her mother. Only a foot from the window, and drenched, she heard the rattling and clanking of her father's old Chevy growing nearer. She glanced over her shoulder and back at the man quickly, trying to find her voice, trying to think of something to say before she would be expected to come running up to her mother's side and to hop into Daddy's truck and leave this moment of different. I'm Molly. Sometimes Molly Beth, she managed. Well, hello, Molly. I'm Jephram, sometimes Jeffrey. I'll be heading back out to New York City in a few days, but if you get bored. With that, he reached out, handing Molly a business card that she immediately tucked into the Bible she realized she had hanging limply at her side in the crook of her left arm. She couldn't let this damned rain take this lifeline away. He smiled again and drove away, rolling the window up as he made his way out of the church parking lot. Who in God's green earth was that, Molly Beth? Honey, I think he's Miss Montgomery's son from New York. He comes in 3 or 4 times a year, and the sweetheart always comes to church with his mama at least once per visit. Isn't that nice? Her mother replied to her father's inquiry, tossing her answer up at him as he stared down from the pickup. Well, why in the hell is he talking to you, Bethy? He ain't got no business with a little girl. Richard, how dare you use that language near the house of God and toward your daughter? That young Mr. Montgomery was just being friendly to a very pretty and very welcoming young woman. That's all right, Molly? Molly smiled, knowing that this exchange with Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Jephram, sometimes Jeffrey Montgomery, was more than that. The way he'd brushed her hand for just a little longer than was necessary as he withdrew from giving her his card cemented it. Don't worry, Daddy. He was just asking for directions. She giggled as she climbed up into the truck, her mother following closely behind. Directions. She knew exactly where he wanted to go, and she didn't mind giving him directions, not in the least. And Molly also knew that he could give her directions. Directions leading somewhere, anywhere, outside of Broken Branch, into something that resembled a life. Molly pet her Bible knowing that it held more adventure and meaning for her than it ever had, now with that little card tucked away. Thank you for listening to Any Given Sunday, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. The piano backing tracks for this story were performed by my dear mother. The rain sound effect comes from freesound.org and was provided by user John Grubbs under a CC0 1.0 Universal Public Domain dedication. The beautiful loop at the end of the track also comes from freesound.org from user Little Robot Factory and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution License 3.0. Thank you to all three contributors for adding to this story.
Please stick around for the next short story from Prose, So They Stopped. So They Stopped, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. KIC 846285 was Robert's life. There was nothing else like it in the universe. Well, there was nothing else like it in the universe that mankind knew about as of now, and that was almost the same thing. So, Robert classified KIC 846285 as unique, even though his beloved science told him that such bold claims were a bit overreaching and, by all means, were not wholly provable. Even still, what a wonderful job he had. He sat night after night watching the little indicators that stood for the energy swells and wanes of his beloved star. Though there had been no real contact from the megastructures that had now been deemed as unnatural phenomena, he knew that he would be the one on duty the night that the habitué made real first contact. The ever-quickening pulse of the lights reminded him of his grandmother's bubbling Christmas lights on the old fir trees of his youth, but his rational mind quickly shut out those sleepy, nostalgic thoughts as soon as they came on. These indicators were tracking the uses of these megastructures by the habitué. They were transporting ships and goods. They were leaping across galaxies in no time. They were making gods real. Pulse, pulse. Ebb and flow. Pulse, pulse. Wax and wane. Then all the dials lit up at once, blinding Robert. The recording equipment squealed like some sort of great digital beast being gutted in front of him. He all but fell out of his chair, fumbling to get the volume dial turned down, but it would not budge. The room grew in intensity. Incandescent and shrill, it became a place of pain. Thoughtful boredom became fear, bordering on utter terror for Robert. This was it. The habitué were trying to contact Earth. They were trying to speak to him. After his life of mediocrity, here was the representative of the entire human race. As trained, he prepped his microphone that used the SETI satellites to broadcast sounds out toward the megastructures. The newest, most advanced terrestrial technologies now ensure that these messages were not years in the deliveries. Using the pre-existing megastructures, they were all but instantaneous. He spoke. He read the lines that the governments of the world had agreed upon. It was a message of welcoming and hope. It was meant to underscore all the best features of human culture. He repeated those lines, still competing with the cacophony around him. The sound grew.
The lights swelled. The heat from all the output from the machines was becoming unbearable, but Robert stuck to his script, repeating it and repeating it and repeating it until he was screaming into the microphone and, in a futile attempt to block the sound from his ears, his hands were pressing so hard against his head that he knew he was bruising his temples. He pressed play and let the message begin cycling through the pre-recorded messages being read in every living language of the world, and some dead ones to boot. The recording hadn't made it 30 seconds in before the wall of sound and light abruptly stopped. The sounds, even the ambient hum of the SETI ears into deep space, went silent. The lights, even the power indicators assuring the scientists that the machines were simply turned on, went black. No pulse, no ebb and flow. No pulse, no wax and wane. Robert began to speak into the microphone again, becoming more and more feverish, becoming more and more desperate to reach out to the habitue. But it was all fruitless. It would prove to be fruitless forever soon enough. KIC 846285 and its megastructures could no longer be experienced via Kepler after that night, via any structures or equipment after that night. In fact, the whole area looked devoid of anything at all. It was as if the habitue had thrown up a screen to obscure any attempts to look into their world again. Still, the SETI crew manned the stations faithfully, waiting for the habitue to re-establish contact, or at least until they chose to allow the human race to glimpse into their world again. Robert continued to gaze long and hard into that once vibrant abyss, and he couldn't help but know that this abyss really was gazing right back at him. Thank you for listening to So They Stopped, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. All content for So They Stopped was created by me. The sound effects have been uploaded for download at freesound.org under my username FallbackCrush. Freesound.org hosts an amazing community based on sharing that enhances a great many projects.
That does it this week for Prose. I do hope you enjoyed these older stories that we revisited. Please keep your eyes open for the next episode, which will be out in 2 weeks' time. And as always, love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.